The date was August 1st, 1943. Over the oil fields of Ploiești, Romania, the sky had transformed into a vision of hell itself. 24-year-old pilot, Second Lieutenant Robert Sternfels, gripped the controls of his B-24 Liberator bomber, call sign Sandman, as German flak batteries unleashed a storm of steel and fire. The air was so thick with anti-aircraft fire that it looked like you could walk on it. And somewhere in that chaos, everything went catastrophically wrong. "We're hit! We're hit!" The voice of the tail gunner, Sergeant Mike Rojas, crackled through the intercom, his words nearly drowned out by the deafening explosion that had just torn through the rear of the aircraft. What happened next would become one of the most extraordinary and terrifying feats of aviation in World War II history. But to understand the full weight of what these men were about to endure, you need to know what they were flying into. Operation Tidal Wave was supposed to be the decisive blow against Nazi Germany's fuel supply. 178 B-24 Liberator bombers, carrying over 1,700 young American airmen, had taken off from bases in Libya with a single, crucial objective: destroy the oil refineries at Ploiești, which supplied nearly one-third of Hitler's fuel. Without it, the German war machine would grind to a halt. But intelligence had failed them. The Germans knew they were coming, as Sandman made its bombing run at an altitude of just 300 feet so low that the crew could see the terrified faces of German soldiers on the ground. The aircraft was savaged by ground fire. A 20mm cannon shell ripped through the tail section, destroying the rear stabilizer and severing critical control cables. Another shell punctured the No. 3 engine, which immediately began streaming black smoke and flames. "Bob, we've got to turn back," Co-pilot Lieutenant James Walsh shouted over the roar of failing engines and rushing wind that now howled through the torn fuselage. But there was a problem. A catastrophic problem. When Sternfels tried to bank the aircraft left to head back toward friendly territory, the plane barely responded. The damage to the tail had been severe. The rudder was hanging by mere threads of metal. The entire rear control surface was compromised. And then came the words that would change everything. "Skipper." It was Flight Engineer Tech Sergeant Harold Chen, his voice tight with fear. "The tail assembly is coming apart. Every time you turn left, I can see daylight through the cracks. It's spreading. If you keep turning, the whole tail section is going to tear off." In the cramped cockpit, with flames now licking at the No. 3 engine and Romanian countryside blurring beneath them at 200 miles per hour, Sternfels made a calculation that seemed insane. If turning left would rip the tail off, what if they turned right? What if they flew backwards? "Jim," Sternfels said to his co-pilot, his voice eerily calm despite the chaos, "we're going to make a hard right turn. We're going to point the nose back toward Romania, toward enemy territory, and then we're going to fly in reverse backwards all the way home." There was a moment of stunned silence on the intercom. "Sir, that's over 400 miles through enemy airspace," Walsh said, his voice barely a whisper. "Flying backwards. It's never been done. It can't be done. It's the only way we survive," Sternfels replied. "If we keep going forward, we fly deeper into Romania with no controls. If we turn left conventionally, the tail breaks apart and we're all dead in 30 seconds. But if we turn right, pivot the nose around, we can use the damaged tail as a crude rudder to fly in reverse." Another explosion rocked the aircraft as more flak burst around them. The No. 3 engine's propeller suddenly seized, the blades windmilling uselessly. "Everyone, this is the pilot," Sternfels announced over the intercom to his 9-man crew. "We're going to try something that's never been attempted. We're going to fly home backwards. If anyone wants to bail out now, I won't blame you. But if you stay, I promise you I will get you home or die trying." Not a single man moved toward the escape hatches. "Then hold on," Sternfels said. "This is going to get rough." He pushed the right rudder pedal to the floor and began the most dangerous turn of his life. The B-24 groaned like a dying animal as it slowly pivoted, its nose swinging through the sky. The damaged tail section screamed in protest, metal grinding against metal. Through the cockpit windows, Sternfels watched the burning oil refineries of Ploiesti, their target, rotate back into view ahead of them. They were now pointing directly at the heart of enemy territory. With the tail pointed toward home and the nose aimed at the enemy, Sternfels did something that defied every principle of aerodynamics and common sense. He increased throttle and began flying backwards. The aircraft shuddered violently. Wind howled through every crack and tear in the fuselage. The instruments spun wildly, designed for forward flight and now completely unreliable. Sternfels was flying blind, by instinct alone, keeping the aircraft in the air through pure force of will and the most delicate touch on controls that barely responded. "Altitude?" he called out. "Sir, the instruments are going crazy," Chen responded. "Best I can tell. We're at 150 feet. We're skimming the treetops." They were flying backwards, at stalling speed, through the most heavily defended airspace in Europe, with German fighters scrambling to intercept them, and a tail section that could disintegrate at any moment. "Fighters at 6 o'clock, Rojas shouted from the tail, which was now technically their front. But in this backwards configuration, 6 o'clock meant the enemy fighters were approaching from what was now their rear, the nose of the aircraft. The waist gunners scrambled to man positions they'd never fired from in this orientation, trying to defend an aircraft flying in a way that shouldn't have been possible. And they had 400 miles to go. 400 miles of enemy territory, flying backwards, in a dying aircraft, with the entire Luftwaffe about to descend upon them. What happened next would test these men beyond anything they had ever imagined. The first Messerschmitt Bf 109 screamed past the nose of Sandman so close that Bombardier Lieutenant Tony Ferrara could see the German pilot's shocked expression through his canopy. The enemy fighter had been positioned for a standard tail attack, the most vulnerable point of any bomber. But Sandman wasn't flying like any bomber the Luftwaffe had ever encountered, with its tail pointed toward Allied lines and its nose facing the enemy. The German pilot found himself staring down the throat of forward-facing guns that should have been pointing the opposite direction. "He doesn't know what to do," Ferrara shouted, firing a burst from his nose guns. The tracers tore past the German fighter, which broke off in confusion, rolling away to reassess this impossible target. But the Luftwaffe's confusion would only last moments. "Chen, give me a damage report. Everything," Sternfels ordered, fighting the controls as the B-24 wallowed through the air like a drunk elephant. Flying backwards meant the aircraft's aerodynamics were completely inverted. The tail, designed to stabilize the plane, was now at the front, creating drag. The nose, meant to slice through the air, was now pushing against it. "Number 3, engine is dead and on fire, still can't get the flames out completely," Chen reported, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Number 2 is running rough, losing oil pressure. Hydraulics are at 30%. We're leaking fuel from the left wing tank. And skipper," Chen paused, "the tail section has a crack running up the port side. It's growing. Every minute we stay in the air, that crack spreads." "How long?" Sternfels asked the question they were all thinking. "Honestly, I don't know if we have an hour or 10 minutes. It's a miracle the tail is still attached at all." Behind them, or rather ahead of them, in their backward flight navigator, Lieutenant David Kowalski was frantically working his charts in a way they were never designed to be used. Flying backwards meant every calculation, every landmark, every compass reading had to be reversed in his mind. "Skipper, we just crossed the Danube," Kowalski called out. "We're over Bulgaria now. Still 350 miles to go at our current speed." He didn't finish the sentence. Everyone knew what the math meant. At least 3 more hours of this nightmare. The intercom suddenly exploded with voices. "Fighters coming in. 3 of them. 12 o'clock high." In the topsy-turvy world of backwards flight, 12 o'clock high meant the German fighters were diving toward what appeared to be Sandman's front, its tail. But that tail section, barely holding together, now housed tail gunner Mike Rojas in the most exposed position imaginable. Rojas swung his twin and 50 caliber machine guns toward the incoming fighters. But there was a problem that made his blood run cold. His gun sight had been calibrated for targets approaching from behind, while the aircraft flew forward. Now, with everything reversed, he was essentially shooting blind, having to calculate lead angles in his head for geometry that shouldn't exist. "Come on, come on," Rojas muttered, squeezing the triggers. The guns roared, but his tracers streaked wide. The Messerschmitts pressed their attack. 20mm cannon shells stitched across Sandman's tail section, their forward section. Now, one round punched through just 3 feet from Rojas's position. Another hit the vertical stabilizer, and Rojas heard the scream of tearing metal. "The crack just got bigger." Chen's voice was tight with panic. "Much bigger." In the cockpit, Sternfels felt the aircraft lurch. The tail section was literally coming apart under fire. In a normal bomber, battle damage to the tail was serious but survivable. But Sandman wasn't normal. That disintegrating tail was now their nose, their guidance system, their only hope of maintaining directional control. "All gunners, listen to me," Sternfels called out over the intercom. "You're shooting at angles you've never trained for. Forget your sights. Shoot where you feel the target will be. Trust your instincts." Waist Gunner Sergeant Bill Morrison, a former duck hunter from Wisconsin, did exactly that. As another Messerschmitt lined up its attack run, Morrison didn't think about aerodynamics or reverse trajectories. He just led the target the way his grandfather had taught him to lead geese. He squeezed the trigger. The burst caught the Messerschmitt in its engine cowling. Black smoke erupted from the fighter, which peeled away trailing fire and disappeared into the clouds below. "Splash one," Morrison whooped. The crew erupted in cheers, but Sternfels cut them short. "Stay focused. We're still flying backwards over Bulgaria with half a tail, and the Luftwaffe still hunting us. Walsh, how's our fuel?" Co-pilot Walsh checked the gauges, then checked them again, hoping he'd read them wrong. He hadn't. "We're burning fuel twice as fast as normal," Walsh reported. "The backwards flight is creating so much drag that the engines are working overtime just to keep us in the air. At this rate, Bob, we might not make it to friendly territory. We might not make it to the Mediterranean." A heavy silence fell over the intercom. They'd survived the initial damage, survived the impossible turn, survived the fighter attacks. But now mathematics itself was becoming their enemy. The laws of physics were catching up to them. "Then we make the aircraft lighter," Sternfels said quietly. "Start throwing everything out. Ammunition we've already fired, empty shell casings, everything that isn't bolted down and essential. Radio operator, send one last message to base. Tell them our situation, our heading, and that if we go down, we're going to try for the sea." Radio operator Tech Sergeant Leonard Oakes tapped out the message in Morse code, his hand trembling. He didn't mention that their radio had been partially damaged in the attack, and he had no idea if anyone would receive the message. The crew began their grim work, throwing equipment out of the waist gun ports. Empty ammunition cans tumbled into the Bulgarian countryside below. The spare oxygen tanks went next, then toolkits, then anything they could pry loose. Every pound mattered. But even as they worked, another crisis was developing. "Skipper, number 2 engine temperature is in the red," Chen called out. "It's overheating. We're going to lose it." Sternfels looked at the engine gauges. Chen was right. The number 2 engine was dying. When it went, they'd be down to 2 engines trying to fly backwards, with catastrophic damage, over hundreds of miles of enemy territory. "How much longer can we nurse it?" Sternfels asked. "Maybe 30 minutes, maybe 5. That engine could seize any second." Through the cockpit window, Sternfels could see the sun beginning to sink toward the horizon. They'd been flying backwards for nearly an hour. It felt like a lifetime. His arms ached from wrestling the controls. His vision was starting to blur from the strain and concentration. And they still had so far to go. Then Navigator Kowalski's voice came through the intercom. And for the first time since the attack began, there was a note of something other than fear in his voice. "Skipper, I've got a visual on the mountains. We're approaching Yugoslavia. If we can make it over those peaks, we'll be over partisan territory. Not exactly friendly, but better than Bulgaria. Altitude? Sternfels asked. We're at 4,000 feet. The mountains ahead peak at 6,500. Walsh turned to look at Sternfels, his face pale. Bob, we can't climb. Not in this configuration. We can barely maintain level flight. Sternfels stared at the mountains rising ahead of them like a granite wall. In a normal aircraft, climbing 2,500 feet would be routine. But Sandman wasn't normal. Flying backwards, with massive damage, with failing engines, climbing might be the thing that finally killed them all. We don't have a choice, Sternfels said. If we try to go around, we add another 100 miles to the journey, and we don't have the fuel. We go up and over, or we die. Trying. He pushed the throttles forward. The two remaining good engines roared, straining against the unnatural aerodynamics. The damaged number 2 engine screamed in protest, its temperature gauge shooting even further into the danger zone. Sandman began to climb, backwards, toward the mountains. But the mountains weren't the only obstacle ahead. What waited on the other side would test these men in ways they couldn't imagine, because in war, salvation and destruction often wear the same face. The needle on the number 2 engine's temperature gauge wasn't just in the red anymore. It had gone beyond the gauge's maximum reading. It should have seized by now, Chen muttered, staring at the impossible readings. By every law of engineering, that engine should be a frozen block of metal, but it wasn't. Against all odds, the number 2 engine kept turning, kept burning, kept pulling them higher toward the mountain peaks that loomed ahead like the teeth of a saw. Altitude 5,000 feet, Walsh called out. Rate of climb, 50 feet per minute. 50 feet per minute. The mountains were 6,500 feet high. At this rate, they had 30 minutes of climbing ahead if the engines held, if the tail held, if the laws of physics gave them just a little more time. Through the cockpit windows, Sternfels could see the peaks growing closer, their snow-capped summits turning pink in the fading light. Behind them ahead in their backward flight, the sun was setting over Romania, painting the sky blood red. Then the number 2 engine made a sound that shouldn't come from any machine designed by human hands. A grinding, shrieking metallic scream that vibrated through the entire airframe. It's seizing, Chen shouted. But incredibly, impossibly, the engine didn't stop. It kept turning, slower now, rougher, like a wounded animal refusing to die. The propeller blades looked like they were moving through molasses. 5,200 feet, Walsh called out. Rojas's voice crackled through the intercom from the tail section. Skipper, I can see through the crack now. It's 3 inches wide. The whole tail is flexing with every gust of wind. Can you see the mountains? Sternfels asked. Yeah, I can see them. We're not going to make it over. Yes, we are, Sternfels said quietly. Then louder, to the entire crew. Listen to me. This aircraft has taken everything the Germans could throw at it. It's kept flying when it should have fallen from the sky an hour ago. That engine is still turning when it should be dead. We're flying backwards across enemy territory in a configuration that shouldn't be possible. We've already done the impossible. We can do it one more time. The crew said nothing, but Sternfels could feel their renewed determination through the intercom static. 5,800 feet, Walsh announced. We're 700 feet from the peaks. Morrison, the waist gunner, was now standing in the opening, watching the mountains approach. I can see trees, he said softly. Individual trees on the slopes. 6,000 feet. The mountains were so close now that the crew could see the details of the rocks, the shadows in the valleys. Sandman was barely climbing anymore, the engine screaming, the airframe shaking. 6,200 feet. We're not going to clear it. Sternfels made a decision. Everyone, get to the tail. Move as much weight as possible to the back of the aircraft. Now. It was counterintuitive putting weight in the damaged tail section, but in their backwards configuration, moving weight to the tail meant moving it to the front of their reversed flight, pitching the nose up, giving them a few more precious degrees of climb. The crew scrambled, crawling toward the tail section as the mountains rushed toward them. Kowalski, Morrison, Ferrara. Everyone who could move pressed themselves as far back in the fuselage as possible. The aircraft's nose pitched up. The stall warning horn began to blare. 6,400 feet. Through the cockpit window, Sternfels could see the tallest peak directly in front of them in their backward flight. Directly behind them, a massive granite wall with trees clinging to its slopes. 6,500 feet! Sandman cleared the peak by less than 50 feet. Pine trees scraped the underside of the aircraft with a sound like fingernails on metal. Then they were over, the mountain falling away beneath them. The crew erupted in cheers, but it died quickly, because what they saw on the other side of the mountains was worse than what they'd left behind. A massive storm system stretched across the valley below. Dark thunderheads towering to 20,000 feet. Lightning flickered in the clouds, like artillery fire, and they had to fly through it backwards with a cracked tail and dying engines. No, Walsh breathed. No, no, no. But there was nowhere else to go. Their fuel was nearly gone. They couldn't turn around. Turning would rip the tail off. They could only go forward, backward, into the storm. Everyone strap in, Sternfels ordered. This is going to be the roughest ride of your lives. They entered the storm like a moth flying into a furnace. The first gust hit Sandman like a giant's fist, slamming the aircraft sideways. Rain hammered against the fuselage with the sound of machine gun fire. Lightning blazed so close that the cockpit filled with white light and the smell of ozone. "The crack!" Rojas screamed from the tail. "It's spreading! Every time we get hit by wind shear, it spreads!" Sternfels fought the controls, but controlling an aircraft flying backwards through a thunderstorm was like trying to steer a leaf in a hurricane. They were at the mercy of forces far beyond human control. Another lightning strike. This one so close that it left spots in Sternfels's vision. The radio exploded in a shower of sparks. Oakes yelped and jumped back from his station. "Number 2, engine just failed," Chen shouted. "It finally gave up." Down to 2 engines, flying backwards, through a thunderstorm, with a tail section held together by prayer and stubbornness. Then, through a gap in the clouds, Morrison saw something that made his blood freeze. "Oh God, Skipper!" Look down. Below them, barely visible through the rain, were anti-aircraft gun emplacements, dozens of them. Yugoslav territory. But these weren't partisans. These were German positions, and they had just spotted the impossible sight of a bomber flying backwards through the storm. The first flak burst exploded off their port side, buffeting the aircraft. Then another. The Germans were firing blind through the storm, but there were so many guns that they didn't need accuracy. "We can't take another hit," Chen screamed. "The tail won't hold." But Sternfels saw something the others didn't. Through the storm, beyond the flak, beyond the mountains, a thin line of lighter sky, the edge of the storm. And beyond that, if Kowalski's calculations were right, the Adriatic Sea, Allied territory, safety. It was 20 miles away. 20 miles through hell. "Hold together," Sternfels whispered to the aircraft, his hands gentle on the controls despite the violence around them. "Just a little longer, girl. Just hold together. A little longer." And incredibly, impossibly, Sandman did. The tail section flexed and groaned and screamed, but it held. The 2 remaining engines sputtered and coughed, but they kept turning. The crew held their positions despite the terror and the exhaustion and the certain knowledge that they should all be dead. They emerged from the storm into twilight, the setting sun painting everything gold, and there, stretching to the horizon, was the most beautiful sight any of them had ever seen. The sea. But their ordeal wasn't over yet, because now came the most dangerous part of all. "Fuel gauge just hit empty," Walsh announced, his voice hollow. "We're flying on fumes." The Adriatic stretched before them. Dark blue water touched by the last rays of sunlight. Beautiful and deadly. If they went down in the water flying backwards, the nose pointing down at the sea would hit first. driving them under like a dart. No one would survive. "I see land!" Kowalski shouted. "Italian coast, friendly territory, 12 miles!" 12 miles. It might as well have been 1,200. The first engine coughed, then died. Complete silence from the number 4 position. "3 engines down," Chen reported, his voice eerily calm now. They were beyond panic, beyond fear. They'd entered that strange place where death becomes just another problem to solve. Sandman was now flying backwards on a single engine, the number 1. The aircraft began to yaw violently to the right, the asymmetric thrust trying to spin them. Sternfels pushed the rudder pedal to the floor, his leg muscles screaming. "We're not going to make the coast," Walsh said quietly. "Yes, we are." Sternfels' jaw was set. "Everyone, this is the pilot. We're going to ditch in the sea, but we're going to do it on our terms. Prepare for water landing. Get the life rafts ready." "Skipper," Rojas called from the tail, "if we hit water backwards, nose first, we're dead." "Then we won't hit backwards," Sternfels replied. "At the last second, I'm going to try to spin us, flip us around, so the tail hits first." The intercom went silent. What Sternfels was proposing was insanity. The tail section was barely attached. A violent maneuver would rip it off completely. But hitting the water nose first was certain death. 8 miles to coast," Kowalski called out. The single remaining engine coughed, sputtered, kept running, but barely. 6 miles. Sandman was descending now, slowly sinking toward the dark water. Sternfels had no power left to maintain altitude. They were gliding backwards toward the sea. 4 miles. Through the cockpit window, Sternfels could see the Italian coastline clearly now. He could see buildings, roads, the green of trees. Freedom was right there, close enough to touch. 2 miles. The engine died. Complete silence, except for the whistle of wind through the damaged fuselage. Sandman was now a glider, flying backwards, with no power and no options. 1 mile to coast, altitude 500 feet. They weren't going to make it. Simple physics. They'd come so far, survived so much, and they were going to hit the water half a mile from shore. "Brace for impact," Sternfels shouted. 30 seconds. The water rushed up toward them. Sternfels could see individual waves now, whitecaps catching the fading light. "Everyone, hold on." He grabbed the yoke with both hands. This was it. The moment that would either save them or kill them all. He had one chance. 10 seconds. He yanked the yoke hard right, stomping full rudder. Sandman began to rotate, spinning on its axis. The tail section screamed. Metal tearing. The crack that had been growing for 400 miles suddenly split wider. 5 seconds. The aircraft continued its spin. Backwards became, sideways became. The tail section hit the water first. The impact was like hitting concrete. The fuselage whipped forward, slamming into the sea. Water exploded through every opening, every crack, every bullet hole. The aircraft skipped once, twice, like a stone, then settled, the nose their backwards rear pointing up at the sky. For a moment, there was only the sound of water rushing in and men gasping for breath. "Everyone out! Now!" Sternfels shouted. The crew scrambled through the waste gun ports. Morrison inflated a life raft. Chen pulled an unconscious Ferrara, who'd hit his head during impact, through the opening. Walsh and Sternfels were the last out, emerging from the sinking aircraft just as the tail section, that valiant, damaged tail that had held together for 400 impossible miles, finally broke away completely. They swam. The water was cold, but they swam. Behind them, Sandman slipped beneath the waves, disappearing into the Adriatic, taking with it the scars of its impossible journey. Italian fishermen reached them first, pulling them into boats, wrapping them in blankets, speaking rapid Italian that none of them understood, but whose meaning was clear. "You're safe. You made it." On the beach, wrapped in blankets, and shaking from cold and shock and relief, the crew of Sandman watched the sun set over the Adriatic. They had flown 400 miles backwards through enemy territory. They had survived what no one should have survived. Did that really just happen? Walsh asked, his voice barely a whisper. I'm not sure I believe it myself, Sternfels replied. 3 days later, after being checked by medics and debriefed by intelligence officers who struggled to believe their story, the crew was flown back to their base in Libya. When they arrived, the entire squadron was waiting. The base commander approached Sternfels, his face grave. Lieutenant, I've read your report 3 times. I've interviewed your entire crew separately, and I still don't understand how you did it. Neither do I, sir, Sternfels admitted. That aircraft kept flying when it shouldn't have. That tail held together when it should have fallen off. We made it on luck and prayer, and an airplane that refused to quit. The commander nodded slowly. The engineers want to examine the wreckage, but... He paused. It's at the bottom of the Adriatic. All we have is your story. The story of 10 men who flew a broken bomber backwards across enemy lines and lived to tell about it. Sir, Rojas spoke up, we didn't just fly backwards, we flew home. There's a difference. And there was. Because home isn't just a place, it's a promise. The promise Sternfels had made to his crew in the burning skies over Romania. The promise to get them home or die trying. He'd kept that promise.